they could make a lot of money by selling TikTok, but they're not going to. They would rather be banned. They would rather lose 170 million customers in the US than sell it to another company. And, that could only be because of the Chinese government. I can't think of any other reason why a company would say, no, we're not willing to sell.
Hey everybody, welcome to China Insider. Today we got a special episode. I get to sit down with somebody who's done a lot of research into TikTok, and especially her recent video is the media skewing its coverage of TikTok ban, talking about a question that now everybody's been looking into, which is the reason behind why TikTok in the United States, or I guess one of the reasons it's been so hard to for it to be removed or divested. And let me just introduce my guest today, Holly. Thank you so much for joining us. And she actually recently started her own YouTube channel, and it's Newspeak. So I'll put the link to the channel in the description, as well as the link to the video, so you guys can watch that. So this video is going to be more about exploring the reasons behind her video. So make sure to check out her video first, and then you can come back and watch this one for all the expanded discussion on the issue. So Holly, let's get started. I recently came across this article from NPR. So the writer for this article says that officials, so this is US officials, say that TikTok is a security concern. But then in the writer says that this is without direct evidence. So basically saying that defending TikTok, the US officials saying this is a national security issue, but it's really not. So why are media outlets like NPR and others, when clearly there are evidence suggesting that TikTok is a national security threat, it looks into the data, it's brainwashing kids, yet they're actively writing these articles to defend it?
Yeah, well, I think you have a few different things going on. First of all, the nature of information warfare is that oftentimes, you don't see bullets flying until, you don't see how this information is being used till it's too late. So that's one issue. Yes, you can say that there have been a lot of problematic things. For example, a former executive at ByteDance suing his former employer, and it came out in the lawsuit that the Chinese government was using TikTok to track, I think it was Hong Kong democracy protesters, Enes Kanter Freedom, the NBA player who was kicked off TikTok. For people who don't want to acknowledge that this is a threat, you can say, oh yes, well, there's no bullets flying. China hasn't used this information to say target Americans who, don't like China or, are critical of the government, and, they're not like, rounding them up or, so in a certain sense, it's easy to say that there is no real threat yet. But the problem is, especially as we're facing a potential war over Taiwan, this information can be used in all kinds of ways that we, sometimes can't even think about. And then the other thing you have is you have the incentive, both on the individual level by journalists who are on TikTok and at the institutional level. So because TikTok, it has such a young user base, and that's a really hard user base for media companies to get, because most people who read the media, at least the traditional media, are older. So there was a Reuters Institute study that found that about half of newsrooms are on TikTok right now. That's simply because it's a really hard audience to reach, and if they can gain a following there, that's great for them.
But it seems like TikTok is able to amplify the voice of many things that they wanted to do. So doesn't that mean that if you're supporting, or at least you're saying that you're not, like TikTok isn't a national threat, you're actually aiding in supporting those like biased views, because on TikTok, clearly certain voices are being suppressed and others are not?
Yeah, and I think, I think a lot of the people who are on, like a lot of these journalists who make that defense will say, well, that's true of any platform, any platform. It's not just giving you, a feed of the people that, tweet or post or whatever in the order that they do it. There is a prioritization that happens. And so some content is just always going to be prioritized more than others. But I think the issue here is what's behind it on TikTok, right? It's like we know that there have been so many cases, and even former employees have come out and said that, they would do things like they would, at one point they said they had a policy of just, really trying to suppress anything that had anything to do with conflict. So for example, I believe it was Human Rights Watch, they tried posting a video of the Tiananmen Square massacre. I think it was specifically the Tank Man video, and it was only viewable to them, and then they complained to TikTok, and then, TikTok made it so that other people could see it. it, but, there is always this kind of question about the censorship and whether they're doing this really to promote, what they say is a healthy environment on TikTok, or whether, it's to benefit the Chinese Communist Party. And I think it's pretty clear when you look at all of the other graphic stuff that you see on TikTok that, they're very selective about how they, decide what they allow.
That's what I want to get into, because now TikTok has sued the US government over the decision to divest. But within the court filing, we can see that TikTok admits that the Chinese government does not want it to be divested, because then TikTok would be giving away the recommendation engine, aka the algorithm that made TikTok so successful in the US. So let's just say, right, every social media, obviously they have their own ways of promoting things, but TikTok, the Wall Street Journal has done studies on this where they would actually promote certain things like adult content or drug use content if you stay longer or stay enough time on that particular type of content. So then the question becomes, if Beijing or the CCP is the one that's controlling this algorithm, isn't that something that I think journalists or news media should actually focus on, not defending it? Because I feel like that's where things step out of the boundary of so-called free speech, the First Amendment, or I think even with journalists, sure, you want to be on TikTok because it helps you reach the younger audience. Isn't there supposed to be like a boundary that where, it still exists?
Yeah, I mean, you would like to think that all journalists care about national security and also, frankly, the mental health. I think that's one of the, going back to the information warfare that China's doing, that's one of the things that they're doing to, divide society, break down, the American population, so that if it does come to a war, we're not able to fight that war. But yeah, I mean, you would think so. I think, going back to the algorithm, I think it is really telling that, starting back in, it was, I think, 2019, 2020, when Trump tried to ban it, he did it through executive order, and it met with resistance in the courts. And then, it was very telling because around that time, that's when China started passing laws that basically said that these informational products, like an algorithm that's developed in China, you can't sell those to a foreign entity without permission. And so you can see that while, ByteDance and TikTok, they're trying to separate themselves from China. China considers that its property. You see ByteDance come out and saying that they will not sell TikTok, which means the only other option is a ban. So, just from the raw, perspective of, like, what are their incentives here? They could make a lot of money by selling TikTok, but they're not going to. Yeah. They would rather be banned. They would rather lose 170 million customers in the US than sell it to another company. And, that could only be because of the Chinese government. I can't think of any other reason why a company would say, no, we're not willing to sell. Yeah,
you mentioned that something interesting too is the Chinese government, the CCP really tries to do a lot of things where it's actively losing money. Say that in this deal with TikTok, like you said, they would make a lot of money, but it seems like they care more about the influence aspect more than, I guess, monetary gains, which makes sense if you're a government. But this is not just with TikTok, right? With EV cars, with Huawei before, with telecom, 5G, etc. Everywhere they go, that this cheap, or to not make money, use subsidies or whatnot, seems like to buy influence is a way to go. So do you think TikTok, rather being banned than to divest, is kind of the CCP's method to choose to preserve its like sort of influence and to try to see if we can maybe come back another day? Or do you think this might be like we'd rather just withdraw, lose this, than to expose that to the American companies?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think, first of all, one of the big issues with TikTok is they really haven't opened themselves up to outside researchers. Now, they claim they have, but at least the reporting that I've seen, nobody knows who those researchers are. So, I do think, first of all, the Chinese Communist Party is scared for people to look under the hood, see what's actually in the algorithm, see how bad it is. I think they're really hoping to drag this through the courts, try to get some wins there, take it. I think a lot of people expect it to go to the Supreme Court for this to be decided. So I think they're really hoping that delay. And, when Trump first started trying to ban it, there were 100 million users in the US who were on the app. Then, I think it was March of 2023, when the CEO testified before Congress, 150 million people had joined. Now it's 170 million. That is like half of the US population. Okay, so they're also hoping, I think, that by increasing the user base, they're going to, increase the support for themselves and hopefully put pressure on Congress and the judges and basically change the culture in the US to, be against a ban.
Which is interesting considering what TikTok did leading up to this congressional bill was that they got people to mobilize a massive amount of people to call into the office of lawmakers.
Yes.
Some of them even got death threats, etc. I think it backfired, but it also felt like TikTok has a great way of mobilizing its audience viewership or whatnot. But what's interesting is in your video you talk about this whataboutism with data security. So you mentioned something I thought was interesting was that, well, China can get data one way or another. Maybe it's not through TikTok, maybe it's through another. It's almost like you don't need to ban TikTok because the worst thing, the inevitable stuff will happen anyways. So it seems like they're defending not to remove a platform just because something else could still happen. Why do you, and I see this not just with the TikTok case, but with a lot of stuff, like even in China, the CCP talks about you can't live without us, you can't live without the Chinese Communist Party. How do you think that relationship sort of created or formed?
Yeah, so that's interesting. And, it's hard to kind of tease out all of the motivations behind why journalists report what they do, but there have been several influential organizations like the ACLU, I think it's the Digital Frontiers Foundation, they've come out against a ban. And yes, their argument is that, well, China is just able to kind of take our data from all kinds of places. They could just buy it from a data broker. But two things. First of all, one of the things in this legislation that passed that would, allow for a ban was that foreign governments who are considered adversarial to the U.S., they are not allowed to buy either government entities or just regular companies in those countries are not allowed to buy Americans' data. Now, it's a very hard thing to enforce. It's very easy to create a shell company here in the U.S. and buy the data and ship it over or whatever. But, the fact that they're saying, well, we can't, have a TikTok ban because, China could still buy our data. I think it's kind of like throwing up your hands and saying, well, we just can't do anything about this problem, so let's not even try, And I feel like, no, we have to try. And India did it for the same reason. The India banned all Chinese apps from the country. And yeah, it was a problem, but, not a problem. Yes, there were people who didn't like that, but they adapted. There are other apps now, like other native apps came into existence to kind of fill the void. So, yeah, I don't think this is a real argument. And, you do have to look at why are these organizations saying this? Is it really, the other argument I hear is free speech. Yeah. Well, is it really free speech if China is controlling the algorithm and controlling what you see and, what kind of content gets promoted? You could say that's, their censorship is not really our free speech. So
do they fundamentally not believe that TikTok is a weapon of the CCP or it's a national security issue?
The latest polling I heard on this issue is that a majority of Americans do think that there is a national security threat with TikTok. I think, unfortunately, with the media, often the people who are most vocal are the ones that you hear from, and they're not necessarily the most informed, and they're not necessarily the most rational people. So, I think you do hear a lot. For example, that NPR piece you mentioned, I can see that their tech reporter is very against a ban, for whatever reason. He just doesn't think it's a threat. But, you also have this schism between the national security reporters and the tech reporters. The tech reporters love tech, and they're not as clued in to the national security issues of the platform. So I do think there's just kind of this built-in lack of awareness, when your job is just to cover tech and not national security.
All right. Well, Holly, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. And maybe next time we'll have to talk about something else from China that is causing problems. All right, and thanks for watching this special episode of China Insider. And make sure to, again, I'll put the link to her video in the description so you can check out her channel. Make sure to subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching this episode. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.